Well, many of you would probably love to receive your Social Security checks tax-free. Here are three pretty compelling reasons that it shouldn't be. We're going to reference this book here, Social Security, Simple and Smart. The author worked for the SSA for 32 years in a variety of different positions. We're going to reference that. Let's get into it. First and foremost is the most obvious, and that is going to be our national debt. Currently, Social Security, depending on which projection you look at, is projected to be depleted completely, the trust fund, that is, that's paying out Social Security benefits, by 2035. Now, if we remove taxes from those Social Security checks, then there's going to be less revenue or less money that's continuing to go into this trust fund to pay out benefits. So if that happens, naturally, the projection would decrease. So if it was 2035 is the projection that you were looking at, then, for example, according to AI here, Google's AI, benefits would run out potentially in 2033. Now, Trump is one of the first to, at least in recent times, to want to make Social Security tax-free. However, there's definitely a lot of groups that are warning about that. You see here, this says in 6 years under his plans, that would be 2031, maybe 2032, depending on how you calculate it. But that is with no changes. And whether Social Security becomes tax-free or not, what we can expect is that changes will be made. So we're going to reference the book here. First thing is that he said, he always gets the question of, will Social Security be there when I retire? Especially from younger people. Maybe they see their parents or grandparents benefiting from Social Security, and maybe they didn't save up a ton of money throughout their life to have in a portfolio or whatever it might be, and that's what they're solely relying on. And maybe they feel that they might be in a similar position, so they're asking, is it going to be there? And he says instead what they should be asking is not will it be there, but how will it change? A lot of changes have been made throughout the almost 90 years of Social Security, whether that be retirement age, whether that be how it's taxed. And he says it will change again in the future. But a Social Security system that provides monthly benefits for retirees and for people with disabilities, as well as survivor benefits for the families of workers who have died, will always be with us. And we're not alone. Providing social insurance benefits is something that every civilized country on the planet does for its citizens. To learn more about how it could change, now we're going to flip to a different section. So he says it's always going to be there. There are people that disagree with this. However, if it were to go away, given that 90 years isn't that long of a time when you look back at the history of the United States or the history of the stock market, for example, it's unlikely, I believe, that it goes anywhere anytime soon. They like to delay things. It's kind of like an extended version of what we're seeing right now with Trump's tariffs. He makes a threat. He sets a date. Stock market panics. That date comes. Companies, or countries rather, retaliate, try to make a deal, strike back. Things get put off, kind of like the government shutdowns as well. It always comes down to the last minute. Delays happen. It's just on a larger scale here with Social Security and a larger timeline. I think we can expect to see that for quite some time at the worst case scenario. So now, here are a couple ways that things could change. However, so there's cut benefits and there's also raising revenues. So the first is that the retirement ages get raised. So they used to be 65 was the original retirement age where you received your full benefit. Now it's 67. So that's been changed. Others are reducing the cost of living adjustments. So to account for inflation, it's called a COLA or a COLA, Social Security checks increase each year. So there's a formula they use to calculate how much that's going to increase by so that people who are relying on Social Security don't get wiped out when inflation occurs. So one thing that they could do is decrease this benefit or multiply this formula, for example, by 75%. So they cut that benefit a little bit, and then they would have more revenue that's going back into the system with a trust fund to continue to pay out benefits. Of course, this would potentially pay out benefits longer, but that would mean that it wouldn't go quite as far if it's accounting for inflation a little less. Another possibility is that benefits are reduced by 5% for all future retirees. This would cause a 35% fix if it was just decreased by 5% for all future retirees. Another one is a means test, so reduce benefits to people making 100,000 plus, a 50% fix if they were to do this. However, it kind of turns into a welfare program if they do this, but it would ensure that it's paid to people who need it the most. So that is another possibility. Then on the raising revenues side of things, there is raising Social Security payroll tax by 0.5%. This would be a 53% fix if they did that. However, tax rates haven't increased since 1983, but it's a modest price to pay for a long-range Social Security benefits. So that's another possibility there. Tax all earnings. So currently, payroll tax is capped at $168.6 thousand. If they just take this off and tax it on all income, that of course would bring them more tax revenue. Not saying that's good, not saying that's bad. They could do that. Tax all Social Security benefits. Currently, only a portion is taxed, the opposite of what Trump is proposing to make it tax-free. A possibility is that they end up in the future going tax-free initially, but shifting back not to where it is now, where only a portion is taxed, but taxing all of it to try and make up for some of that revenue. This wouldn't be quite as big of a fix, but hopefully that would not result if Trump were to make it tax-free. And lastly, require all state/local government workers to pay into Social Security as opposed to paying into employee pension plans. Those are a couple fixes that could be forced to be made but likely in the near future, given that the budget is currently set to deplete in 2035, maybe earlier, if it was tax-free. So that plays in right to number 2, and that is that it reduces incentive to work and save. Now, I wrote here, this means that if there is more spending going on, because the money is tax-free, because people have more money, on the other side of things, this could actually be a pro. And the reason for that is the more spending that's going on in the economy, the more taxation that is occurring on those dollars, the higher tax revenue that the government receives. And hopefully, that is potentially an argument for making things tax-free so they get more revenue so they can keep the trust fund longer. However, I think it's much more likely that there is less incentive to work longer, to take Social Security earlier, in a lot of cases because it's tax-free and they don't need as much pre-tax dollars to retire on. Now, the only thing that I would also state in response to the more spending is that there is a sort of, and this is actually from another book here, Economics in One Lesson by Henry Hazlitt, an economist of the Austrian school of thought, more libertarian in his economics, but he talks about the broken window fallacy. And that is that there is this talk of if a child, for example, is playing in the street and throws a baseball at the window of a bakery, for example, and breaks the window, that there is a type of economist that will come and say, this is actually a pretty good thing because the window's broken and now the window fixing business is going to be able to fix that window, and the baker is going to pay $200 to this company. So that gets more spending going in the economy. Now that person who fixed the window is now able to go give his business. Let's say it cost $200 to fix the window, and he fixed it for that. He received his money, and then he can go and take that money and maybe he buys a suit. For example, he wasn't going to do that if he didn't get that $200. So since he got it, he can go and pay a tailor $200 for the suit. Now, since he did that, there's more taxation that's going on. The tailor can then take the $200, spend it on another business, and that $200 would have never been circulating in the system if that kid had not broken the window. However, he points out that the problem with this is that the baker himself might have actually wanted to go spend that $200 elsewhere. Let's say, for example, that he was going to make a change on his car, and that was going to cost $200. Let's say it was tires or something like that. I know tires are much more expensive, but you get the point. Now, he's not going to be able to do that. If he was, he would have spent the $200. The person who owns the tire shop would have that money. He'd be able to go and spend that on whatever he was going to spend $200 on. Maybe he wanted to go to a different tailor. As an example, that tailor receives the $200 and the cycle continues. So what Henry Hazlitt points out is that even though the broken window would generate a lot of new revenue or cash flow in the economy, or spending, rather, is a better way to say that, because the money would go to the broken window, or the person who fixes the broken window, which would go to the tailor, which would go to another business. While that is all true, all of what would have happened over here gets removed. So it's a zero sum, and it actually cancels out. So same thing here with Social Security. Even if it did increase spending, and that caused more taxation from the government to fund the trust fund, it would have to outperform or be more than, in total, what they would have received if they were just taxing it in the first place. And if people don't spend and they end up just saving that money, then that's where the broken window perhaps actually is a good thing, quote unquote, in that money, if the window was broken, they have to spend it, and then it gets into the economy and starts going around. If they would have otherwise just kept that money in a savings account and would have kept it there forever. With all of that said, I think it is very likely that, and it probably wouldn't necessarily be shown that much or something we would really see in our day-to-day lives in people, not that big of a change, but it would slightly reduce the incentive to continue working longer and instead retire earlier and save. But even when that happens at a very, very small scale and we don't really notice it, it makes a big difference when you're talking about over 300 million American citizens. Third is that, kind of tying back in with the very first point, if Social Security becomes tax-free, this is demanding changes in other areas sooner. Now, there's already going to have to be changes. We've talked about this. If it's projected to be depleted by 2035, there's going to have to be changes, but this would make that happen even earlier. For example, Social Security's original age, as I mentioned earlier, was 65. It's now 67. it's not unlikely that in unison with the previous change, this continues to increase. A lot of people, as we read there in one of the examples earlier, think that it could be increased to age 70, not just another 2 years like previously. And what is interesting about that, or unfortunate rather, is that the US currently has the largest gap between what is called health span and lifespan. So there's your health expectancy and your life expectancy. Lifespan in the US, the gap between that currently is around 12.4 and 12.7 years. So that means even though you live to, let's say, age 77 on average, subtract 12 years from that, and that's how long you're actually healthy. So if you're only healthy for 65 years and you're wanting to spend time in retirement traveling, visiting children, volunteering, whatever that is, you're not going to be able to do this, or not as many people are going to be able to do this quite as long, quite as well, maybe not at all, if that retirement age continues to get pushed back. Now, life expectancies have drastically increased since Social Security was established. That's why ages for the full retirement age has also increased. But in terms of using this money to enjoy retirement, that would decrease the likelihood of that being possible. Now, it's not to say that's what Social Security is even meant to do, for people to enjoy their retirements, but rather to protect them in the last years of their life. However, if that's what you were looking to use Social Security for, this would be a big change. Now, there's other things as well that I talked about in terms of changes that could possibly be made. For example, if the next presidency is not in line with this tax-free Social Security and slingshots it all the way back to fully taxable, which is even more tax than now, to make up for some of that tax revenue, if the strategy did not plan out or pan out how Trump is seeing it to, then that would be more taxes for future retirees. Again, there's plenty of other things that could be changed. The entire income that someone receives, no matter how big it is, could be eligible for paying Social Security tax. Currently, that's about 15.3% for someone who's self-employed. For others, it's half of that. That usually stops after $168.6 thousand in 2025. That number increases a little bit each year to account for inflation. But if they remove that cap, that would cause more taxation on higher earners. And these are just 3 reasons why it might not be a good idea to make Social Security tax-free. Now, ideally, we do make it tax-free. I would love that. And we don't see any sort of big changes, at least negative changes. However, it's just tough to see how that pans out. But it would be tax-free. It's just hard to see it work. So Trump's obviously been very active with tariffs and whatnot. I love it. Let's see how things change. So if he's saying it's going to be tax-free, I imagine that means many other changes he has in his back pocket as possibilities. So let's wait and see how things pan out. And if you would like to, I encourage you to subscribe if you enjoyed this video. Hopefully it was helpful. I release videos 3 times a week. I also do a live stream once a week going into similar topics, all things retirement, some retirement strategies, and I will see you in a future video.